Hello to all of you listening in and watching out there. It is an honor to have you all here today. You are listening in to episode number 163. I am your host, Delia Perry, and today I have the privilege of chatting with Caley Adams. Caley is an artist, designer, and illustrator with a flair for understanding not only what is aesthetically pleasing, but also what translates into profitable branding. Caley is the founder and creative director of Wilds District, where she focuses her efforts on helping women-led emerging brands find the right balance between form and function. Caley's branding insights have given her clients a substantial edge in even the most competitive landscapes, including e-commerce, luxury, lifestyle, beauty, and fashion. Caley has a ton of experience in her field, having worked with companies such as Chanel, Rolex, Ralph Lauren, MAC Cosmetics, Aldo, Warby Parker, Puma, Barkbox, and so many more. That was a long list, Caley. My friends, I cannot wait to dive into Caley's story, and I cannot wait for her to share her wisdom and expertise with you all. So, Caley, welcome to the Girls for Greatness podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's so exciting to finally get the chance to chat with you.
I know. I've been looking forward to this. Tell us a little about where you're from and maybe how you even got into this line of work that you're doing right now, how you just came up with the whole idea to create Wilds District.
Yeah, so my background is in kind of more traditional art, so illustration, kind of more tactile, hands-on mediums. And then through the years, as I evolved and became a stronger artist, I started to look at, okay, what are the avenues for this as a career? And graphic design at one point really jumped out at me as a way to not only be able to use illustration, but also just have a more robust skill set that you could use for a lot of other things. So, and you can like things like typography, color, photography, all that, layering that on top of illustration as well. So that was kind of the gateway and the introduction to it. And then how I ended up getting into building Wilds District is really over time. I have over a decade of experience working in the design field. And my experience in those many years has always been that there are a lot of agencies, lots of studios out there, and a lot of them, most of them, I would say, are run by men. So only 1% of all design studios are actually run by women, which is insanely, is a small number, right? And, I always found that funny being an employee at different studios, mostly because, especially within New York, when I moved here back in 2013, I was starting to do a lot more work within the luxury sector. So I was doing work for fashion brands, beauty, and it was so interesting because a lot of the teams I was on, I was the only female in the room. And we would go into these client meetings, and the teams on the client side would be all women. And I just found it so interesting that the people who were producing a lot of the work, especially within advertising, creating microsites and different experiences for brands, were men, but ultimately the end consumer of most luxury brands is women. So that always seemed like a really big disconnect to me. And I felt often like being the only woman on the team was kind of a privileged place to be, but also challenging because I think sometimes in certain contexts, you kind of get brought along as the token woman. And so that disconnect of these types of studios doing the work that are supposed to be consumed by women and as the end consumer really struck me as odd. And so that inspired me after many years of working in this field to finally go off and build Wilds District, which the goal is to create compelling, really beautiful experiences that are not just kind of print and brand experiences, but also digital as well, which tends to be a more masculine kind of trade within the design space. So product design, a lot of technology, a lot of apps, deep product work, and still focusing within the sector of luxury, particularly just because that alone is a really hard niche to find in the industry.
Right. Right. So your background primarily like through education was design. Is that right? Is that like, yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then when you started working for some of these other bigger companies, that was primarily what you were doing was like designing, whether it was logos or websites or advertising, or is that correct? Okay. I just want to make sure I'm
Yeah.
making
Yep.
that
Kind of
clear.
everything runs the gamut. So a lot of branding work, creating logos and brand systems, but also yeah, websites, advertising, out of home
Interesting.
campaign, really everything soup to
Yeah.
nuts.
So
Yeah.
speak a little bit about maybe, I guess maybe what that was like for you. Like you said, like being the only woman on some of those teams and being maybe the only woman presenting, but yet presenting, for a brand that you said was primarily purchased by women. I mean, I find that so fascinating. In my mind, this is bringing up so many memories of the movie What Women Want.
Yes.
And, you know,
Oh, yes,
and like,
exactly. Oh, that's
and
a good movie.
yeah, because I mean, it's just kind
Uh,
of about, I mean, it just kind of rings true. Like here it was this guy trying to sell, you know, Nike, I think it was to like
yeah,
women and like,
exactly.
you know, how
Oh,
would you
that's so
know?
funny you mentioned.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
makes me want to rewatch that movie. That was
Yeah.
so
True.
great. Yeah, it's totally that kind of that's the way it felt a lot of the times. It was very much like a lot of the experiences were kind of a top level perception of what women would want or what women are interested in. So it was very kind of like some of the deeper kind of incentives for like what makes this person purchase this versus this were lost on a lot of the people I was working with at the time. And so I think the one biggest thing I've learned,
Mm,
especially, is that women are extremely discerning consumers. And
mm,
so they are able to kind of really see nuances between different brands that are very small, and not only see them, but like feel them too, and be able to kind of get a sense of different brands and how they stack up to one another. Whereas I think sometimes that gets overlooked in more male-driven brands, the
mm.
small nuances of like, what is the color palette? How does it feel? Like, what is that emotion that drives you there? Is it, you can think about a jewelry brand, for instance. Is it more petite, feminine, delicate jewelry? Is it chunkier jewelry? But there are different kind of use case scenarios for different styles and different types of women as well. And I think that's kind of the thing that gets lost sometimes is like, I think with any group in particular,
Mm.
there's the risk of being kind of blanketed around like what are female, quote unquote, female interests. And so
Yeah.
that's a challenge because it's obviously like everybody else in the world, it's very nuanced. But I think that there's kind of a reduction that happens with trying to interpret what women are going to want and what drives them to purchase things.
Sure. Yeah, I could definitely see that. That's a really great point. I have so many questions here. You could ask about that, but tell me a little bit about maybe just now your own experience with working with women with Wilds District and how, I guess, maybe how you are maybe helping them approach driving their business or helping them approach, branding from just a different perspective.
Mhm.
I mean, I think like, reading through your bio and everything too, you talked a lot about how uh, it needs to be approached differently, maybe differently than, you know, one woman might think, or even not even so much just differently from a male perspective, but just really understanding like this is what is going to help you, this is what's going to work, and this isn't. And I'm sure there's a lot of things you could speak to, but I'm just curious,
Yeah.
like for you, what you would say for someone starting out.
Yeah. What's interesting is that from our perspective as a studio, we're, a small New York based studio team of four, very small. And I think that that creates kind of like a nice close knit feeling between we're able to really work really collaboratively with our clients in that sense so that they can the nuances of what drives that brand. So ultimately that usually comes down to the founder themselves
Mm,
trying to suss out what's their vision, what are their hopes and goals for the project, And I would say that it's really kind of a fascinating space to be in, especially the luxury and the kind of lifestyle market, particularly because there are so many nuances there. And, one color, for instance, can really make a whole brand shift into a whole different direction. So you how that comes across, and you have to make sure that it's very standard between kind of standardized between brand and digital experiences as well. And I think that's where a lot of things fall flat, where you might build a beautiful brand and have a beautiful experience mapped out for it, but once it translates to the digital experience, oftentimes it falls flat. And I think it's more of a challenge for a lot of modern founders to translate a really beautiful premium experience onto a digital space, just because you have competing needs for really like setting the tone and setting a mood, but also just converting and making sure that everything is data driven and really optimized. And I think that can be a challenge, because sometimes there's a push and pull there of what looks the best versus what's going to function the best. And oftentimes we try to find the middle ground for the customers that we work with, making sure that if there are trade-offs happening, we understand what we are communicating properly, what those trade-offs are, and where they might be gaining things, where they might be losing things. But, you could easily say like, okay, you want to make this site convert, at a higher level. Well, let's just make all the buttons huge and bright red. But that might also lose an individual quality that is going to deter a certain set of audiences too. And at that point, if you're kind of not as nailing the luxury elements in the design, you kind of might be starting to compete in a different type of category. You might be competing just on price rather than, on look and feel.
That's amazing. So are you then kind of heading up a team of women that are all working with other women? Is that kind of how it's done? Like you have different people approach. Yeah.
We try to specialize. It's not to say that we don't work with men or male-led businesses, but I think that is a fun niche for us to work in, particularly because we do have that perspective. I think of, it's just a lot of the space that we work in is kind of, something that's near and dear to our hearts. But the other thing I think that's valuable in working with women entrepreneurs is that I've learned through this business myself, it is incredibly hard to be an entrepreneur, and it's incredibly hard to be a woman in business, particularly because I think that sometimes, we're somewhat more emotional beings. We tend to analyze a lot of things. And so even small things can really feel like failures. I think a lot of the times our level for what qualifies as success is just a lot higher. And there's a lot of pressure on us for that reason. And so I think kind of going through this experience myself and learning the ins and outs of running a business that way and how hard it is and how challenging that is really has broadened or has created a much deeper respect for that I have for other female entrepreneurs that are working out there trying to launch really big ideas. And really, it just keeps me going. That's the one thing that is just so inspiring, knowing that there's stress. They're probably, people are managing many things and many aspects of their lives, and they're still pushing forward on a big dream. And there's nothing more powerful in my mind than that.
Sure. That's amazing. So what are some of the things that you've seen, these women entrepreneurs who come to you, what would you say, like maybe are some of their biggest challenges, or the things that you see are the things that trip up many women as they come to you and are like, can you help me fix this, rebrand this, start this?
Yeah. I think a lot of the times the challenge, when it's your own brand, a lot of the times just putting one foot in front of the other is the hardest part. It's really just understanding like, what is that roadmap? Because like I mentioned before, there's a lot of doubt that can creep in and you can second guess a lot. And so having someone to help guide you through the process, start to finish, is always a really kind of reassuring thing to have. And so what we try to help with, particularly in our relationships, is like, we see it obviously as more than a project or a client. It's a relationship, and we're trying to help people navigate the waters, which is really hard. And so I think that is definitely one of the biggest challenges. But then I guess technically speaking, there's a big disconnect between ideation and execution for a lot of people, where there might be a question mark there of like, okay, I have this big idea, but what are the steps that I can take to get there? And it's hard when you're not familiar with design. And so one of, I think, the things that we're very successful at is really kind of being transparent in our whole process and allowing people to understand the full project, and really kind of hand holding as much as we can, not kind of condescending way, but just, in a way that's like really making people feel comfortable with the process. Because sometimes I think in other contexts, if you're working with larger agencies or whatever, there's kind of this sense of needing to be pushed along. And sometimes I think at the end of those processes, you start to think like, was that really the decision that I made? Or is that really what I wanted? And so I think that the more you can collaborate, iterate together, work on it, kind of think through a lot of things more collaboratively, rather than like this big unveiling of big projects, it's really helpful to educate and help people feel really confident about where they landed at the end, and know all of the reasons, and so that way, if investors or whoever are coming to you and trying to poke holes in your business plan or your thesis for your business, you really have all of the answers for why each decision was made. And that's huge. So we're trying as much as we can to not only produce really great work, but educate and really foster that relationship.
That's awesome. That's awesome. I mean, I can imagine it's a whole bunch of things. I mean, just all the things you said, but just really having, I think, a really good understanding of maybe what, message you want to send, obviously through your brand, through your product, and then knowing exactly, the audience that you want to be targeting. I mean, I think those two things have to be huge. Yeah.
And one other thing that I think is really interesting, and I think that many people struggle with, is this idea of putting yourself out there. Sometimes the most successful brands are the ones who really embrace the weird, embrace the unique aspects. And sometimes I think just human nature, there's this desire for us to blend in, to fit in, because that makes us feel comfortable. It makes us feel, it's evolutionary. It's in our DNA to need to be a part of the group. And so I think sometimes just that is a big piece of advice that I have for people, is just lean into what makes you unique. Don't be afraid of it. And that is where I see a lot of people really failing. And I think that's where you see a lot of brands that are coming out that kind of all just start to look the same. There's a lot of women's brands out there that are pink and tan with script fonts, and like, you look at the people and you're like, is that you? Is that, what you represent? And they're like, maybe they're totally colorful, wild, bizarre, fun, crazy human beings, but for whatever reason, they might be presenting themselves in a way that's not really doing them justice. So it's a hard thing to do, to really find what makes you unique and lean into it, because it can be a very uncomfortable process. It makes you feel sometimes like you're, sticking out like a sore thumb. So
sure. No, that's really great advice. I think good advice in life,
I know, right?
What makes you unique,
I know. And it's easier said than done, is something that I struggle with as well. It's like, sometimes I'm a very odd, kind of eccentric person sometimes, and I'm goofy and weird. And like, I think a lot of the times that comes across, or I think there was a fear for many years of that coming across as unprofessional, as young, as too female, especially in these environments. But then I've started realizing, like, once I lean into those qualities, and I'm a very bubbly, kind of upbeat person, it opens a lot of doors for people. People feel like there's a warmth there, and the people who don't get it, that's okay. Those are the people that I'm not going to be working with anyway. So, it's hard to do.
That's true. No, and I think that brings up a good point too. I mean, I always like to, I think, honing on certain things with these podcasts, but I feel like there's always lessons that can be taken across the board for anyone, maybe even those who are listening in who aren't maybe in business or have that mindset, but just what you said, I mean, leaning into what makes you unique, but then also realizing that you're not for everyone. And I've always said that about even, the podcast that, there may be people that just, they don't resonate with it. They don't like it. They don't like my voice, whatever it is. And that's okay. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah. And that's fine.
I think
Exactly.
sometimes we worry so much about putting something out there and not everyone accepting it or liking it. So,
Exactly. And if you kind of put a parallel to brands in that aspect, you can see something really interesting happening where some of the most compelling brands in the world right now are the ones who do go that extra, they do the weird thing. They, I think the example I cite a lot is Soul Cycle, mostly just because at the time when they launched, look at all these fitness studios, they were going for this very kind of like feminine look and feel, this kind of softer. Soul Cycle came out and it was a whole brand, and it was chunky and like crazy and big typography, bright yellow, and bright yellow is a very polarizing color, but they didn't look at it and go, you know what? How many people like bright yellow? They said, you know what? Bright yellow, that seems like it's a risk, but it's one that's worth taking.
yeah,
And then, that bright yellow has become associated with that. And it's a very distinct advantage for them.
yeah.
And so the same could be said for
Interesting.
humans. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. I'm curious for you, Caley, what has been, since you're now in this space too, and you've started this company and all of that, what have been some of your greatest challenges, or what are some of the things that you've learned about yourself through this whole process?
Definitely. I mean, I think that the biggest thing, kind of going back to what I was saying earlier, but just is just trying to find the confidence to keep pushing. And knowing that, like, if you're feeling uncomfortable, it's probably actually a good thing. Anytime you feel like you want to shy away from something, that might be actually a good signal to kind of lean into it a little bit more. And so for me, building the business is a challenge because it's kind of, they're like anybody. I'm a woman in business launching, a business as well. And it's just, there are challenges where you really doubt yourself or you really doubt your abilities. You look at other people's work and you're like, God, they're so good. It's just painful. Yeah. Like, when will I ever get that good? And you realize that, like, there's just people who look at you and think the same thing. And it's just, you always look at people with kind of a gloss to them. And so I think that's been a challenge for me building the business, is just keep pushing and trying to, like, be confident in the niche that we're catering to, and understanding when, like, people maybe don't sign off on a proposal and don't move forward with us for work. It's not really something to be ashamed of or embarrassed of or whatever. It's just not for them. It's a choice. They move on with somebody else. So that's been kind of the ongoing struggle or challenge, is just trying to continuously find that audience in that niche and know and have the confidence to keep pushing. The other thing that I've been that is kind of a challenge, just in this business, more tactically speaking, is just when it comes to a lot of brands, finding ways to make them feel really fresh and unique, and building a whole ecosystem around them. So not just a logo, but creating, like, what is the feeling and what is that tone, and who are the people who connect with this brand, and trying to think about it on a more deep level, rather than just like looking at what's cool, what's out there for design, and then doing the same thing. So that's always the challenge too in producing new work, is just trying to find, like, keep pushing and innovating to, like, develop your style.
That's
because
true.
if you don't, you really do fall, you can stagnate quite a bit.
Oh, that's great. That's really cool. So in this world that we live in, where there's so many messages, so much advertising, so many things coming at us, I think especially as women, I mean, I'm not saying that men don't have the same, but I feel like women have just a ton. Either that, or I feel like our sense of it a lot of times is just heightened.
Yeah.
That's just, I think, in our DNA and who we are, and maybe all of the things, that go along with being a woman. I'm curious how you maybe advise people to stand apart from that, to find a way to be noticed, or to, have a space in a space that's so big. Like, what would your advice be?
Yeah, it could be so daunting to launch a business for a lot of brands because you look at the landscape and you say, like, I want to launch a skincare brand. How many skincare brands are there out there?
Right.
Unbelievable. All vying for your attention. And I think it's tough as consumers too. Like you said, we're bombarded by lots of different products and brands trying to capture your attention and your curiosity. And I think that it can be a challenge to sift through those too. And it feels overwhelming at times. And there's a reason I think we feel kind of bombarded by a lot of these brands too, is that I think like we're kind of, there's a reason they talk about the pink tax, where we're all kind of expected to look great, talk great, be great, do all of the things, have all the great clothes, to do all the things. And I think that that's a challenge because it creates this kind of scarcity mindset for us. And so I always try to say that in order to stand out for a lot of brands, like, don't try to appeal to like, don't you want this? And you're not a part of this if you don't have it. Really just trying to appeal to more emotional instincts of like, you need to think about the consumer and who they want to become and like what type of person they want to be, and try to find ways to align with that to help them understand like, hey, if you want to come across as more professional in your meetings or whatever, like this is a great brand for you to do X. Or if you want to explore your more eclectic side, do this, and it's good to think about it that way rather than just kind of like showcasing product and saying like, do you like any of this?
Yeah, that's so
just
true.
like really making sure that you are compelling that way. Yeah.
Right. I mean, I like the flip of like you said, of just thinking about the way the person wants to, who that person might want to be or how that it can better them, versus I think a lot of times advertising makes us feel like we're lacking something.
Yes.
Yeah. So
yeah. And you feel talked at too, just kind of like these brands saying like, this will make your dark patches go under eye bags go away.
Right.
This will be, it's like, oh my God, I can buy all these. And that's a really shitty kind of experience because the moment you move on from that belief that you're like, you don't need that, under eye cream or whatever, like that product is meaningless. So to create a deeper emotion, you really need to create like ways that product fits in with that person's identity and who they are.
That's so true. That's so true. Well, there's been so many amazing things that you've shared, Caley. Thank you so much. And I'm just going to close out with a couple of questions, just about some things in general that I ask at the end of each interview. But before I get to that, can you tell us where people can find you? I know I'll put this in the show notes, but where can people find you online and social media?
Yeah, so you can check us out at wildsdistrict.com. That's WILDES district.com. And then, feel free to reach out to, just kind of as a side note, I always, as a human being, love to connect with other people and meet new people and friends. And, if anybody, likes this issue, wants to, or this episode wants to chat more, just feel free to shoot me an email, Caley@wildsdistrict.com. Like I said, I just love meeting people from all different walks of life. If anybody wants to meet up for coffee, that's great too. So
that's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. I love it. So first question, tell me 3 words that best describe who you really and truly are.
Oh, that's a tough question. I think identity is such a tough one to nail down sometimes for people. Because sometimes the things that you gravitate toward in certain times of life change. I think the thing that has stuck with me is just eclectic. I find that when I was younger, it was something I was embarrassed by or afraid of. I had odd music tastes. I have offbeat humor. I like weird movies or whatever. And sometimes I felt as a younger person, kind of a struggle trying to figure out like how that exists in the world. But now it's definitely something I've embraced a lot more. Definitely outgoing too. I realize that, and this is not something I maybe would have said before the pandemic, but I think the pandemic just changed so much for people. When all of a sudden everything ground to a halt, it's like you realize, oh my God, I'm not having all these conversations with these great people. So that's why I was saying, I love chatting with people.
Yes.
because
Yes.
it's human connection is so important to me. And I didn't realize that till it was gone. So,
So true.
outgoing, eclectic, and I mean, creative, right? It's an easy one to say, but it definitely weaves throughout my whole identity as a person. It's a way of not just like a career profession, but it's a way of looking at the world. And I think that everybody has that to some extent. It's just, how much you can claim it as a piece of your identity.
Yeah. That's awesome. That's awesome. So my last two questions, what is one thing that you're currently working on to improve in your own life?
That's another good question too. Just the ability to connect with other people, I think, is constantly something that I'm having on my mind. Just like, how do I form deeper relationships with people? How do I connect better with people? How do I really make the most of my relationships and the people around me? And that's something I'm trying to constantly like work on and get better about reaching out to people, get better about asking how people are doing, and really exploring the things that drive them. I find that the conversations, I had a kid 2 years ago, and I think that a lot of time after you have a kid, for a lot of people, there's this like kind of dumbing down of conversation of like, oh, my kid's in diapers now, like, oh, he's doing this or that. I think that the conversations that are the most important to have are like, what are your goals, or what are your ambitions? Like, talk to me about like, what are you working on? Like, even if it's not work related, it's just like, we all have some sort of goals. And I think it's hard to track of it, and people can lose touch with it. So finding those relationships and talking about the things that drive people is really invigorating conversation. You always walk away like feeling really refreshed. Like, wow, I'm really into this thing right now, and I'm really trying to do this or become this. Those are really exciting conversations.
That's so true. I love that. That's a great thing to be working on too. Really good thing.
Yeah.
Well, we all could be working on that.
I know, right?
Yeah, I know. And so last question, what's one thing you can say you're proud of yourself for being or doing?
I mean, just persisting, I guess, in business, still at this point. It feels sometimes, I think it's easy to wake up every day and just feel like, wow, this is really hard. Especially being someone who's running a business. It's not somebody kind of like checking in with you. There's no one saying like, how close have you come to this, or how much progress have you made? You really have to do it by yourself. And that's really hard. And so that's something always a challenge, but like constantly in flux for me, of trying to think of like, how do I keep the ball rolling and keep my energy going and push through? And even when things are hard, understanding that it's just a season of life, and the end goal is still there.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. Well, Caley, thank you so much for being here. This has been so much fun. I love what you've shared, and I really commend you for commend you for what you're doing with just empowering women to, lead the way in their own unique way. And I think providing a great platform for that, something that's so needed, so that other women, can get their own products and ideas out into the world and be seen and heard. So I really love what you're doing, but thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much.
And likewise too. Yeah, likewise. And thank you so much for having me on today, and for just being a badass host too, and just doing all the things as well. I mean, it takes a lot of work and a lot of grit to do a podcast, and to, talking about the same type of challenges, just keeping the ball rolling and like having to have this conversation. So
this is true.
Can't thank you enough for putting out the awesome content into the world for other people to be inspired by, and hopefully kind of keep them going as well. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you.